My name is Eric Johnson, and I spent 3 unsettling years as the caretaker of St. Michael's Church in the small town of Elmswood. The church, with its 2 sanctuaries, stood as a relic of the past, one built 90 years ago and the other 50 years later. During my tenure, I encountered experiences that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the supernatural. It all began on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. My job often required me to work alone, preparing the church for services or handling maintenance. On this particular day, the rain pattered against the stained glass windows, creating a dim, almost melancholic atmosphere inside. I was in the older sanctuary, organizing some supplies in the back room, when I noticed an eerie chill in the air. I brushed it off as a draft, but the feeling lingered. I was kneeling by an old storage closet, pulling out some old hymnals, when I suddenly felt a presence behind me. As I stood up and turned around, I saw it, a figure standing in the doorway. It was as if it had stepped right out of a nightmare. The figure was tall, wearing a long, dark robe, and had no discernible features, no eyes, mouth, nose, or ears. It had a bald head and an aura that seemed to suck the light from the room. Before I could even process what I was seeing, the figure vanished into thin air. My heart raced as I fled from the church, not stopping until I was safely at home. The next unsettling experience occurred when my cousin Mike came to visit. We were planning a night of gaming, but we realized one of the controllers was missing and left in the church. Despite the thick darkness outside, we decided to go get it. As we approached the church, the old wooden door creaked open, and we stepped inside. The darkness was almost tangible, pressing down on us. We had barely made it a few feet into the new sanctuary when we heard it, a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the room, cutting through the silence like a knife. It was the kind of scream that chills your bones and makes you question your sanity. We bolted out of the church, racing back to the safety of my house. Mike was visibly shaken and declared he would never step foot in the church again. A few weeks later, I had to deal with a more unsettling event involving the church's preschool. The preschool had a storage area upstairs, filled with old toys, extra chairs, and outdated desks. The teacher would sometimes take children up there to select toys for their classes. One day, the teacher took a young girl upstairs to pick out new toys. As they were sorting through the items, the girl pointed towards a corner and said, "Look at the kids playing over there." The teacher turned, expecting to see other children, but the corner was empty, no toys, no children, just dust and shadows. The teacher felt a shiver but chalked it up to her imagination, though she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As these incidents piled up, I found myself growing increasingly uneasy about my role at the church. I started to notice other peculiarities, a cold spot in the older sanctuary, the feeling of being watched even when alone, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to brush them off as figments of an overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. One evening, while alone in the church preparing for a service, I heard footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. I was sure I had locked all doors, yet the sound persisted. Following the noise, I reached the old sanctuary and saw nothing out of the ordinary. The footsteps stopped abruptly as I entered, and the eerie silence that followed was almost more disturbing than the noise itself. I felt as if something, or someone, was playing with me, taunting me with its presence. My final straw came when I decided to stay overnight in the church to try and confront whatever was haunting the place. I set up a small bed in the old sanctuary and tried to sleep, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. I lay there in the darkness, trying to calm myself, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of whispers right next to my ear. I bolted upright, shining a flashlight around the room, but there was nothing there. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, until I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things and left, swearing never to return alone. To this day, the memories of those nights at St. Michael's haunt me. The church stands as a grim reminder of the unknown and the eerie experiences that lurk in the shadows. I still wonder what I really encountered there, but I have no desire to find out. Some places are best left alone, their secrets buried deep within the walls. My name is Michael, and for nearly a decade, I worked as a janitor at St. Mark's Church. This imposing structure, initially erected in the early 1900s, was a blend of original buildings and more recent additions. The old buildings always held an eerie atmosphere, a lingering sense of history and secrets that seemed to watch you as you walked the halls alone. As a devout Christian, I believed in the presence of demonic entities and the unseen spiritual warfare that surrounded places of worship. From the very beginning, there were certain buildings within the church grounds that gave me an uneasy feeling. The air felt heavier, the shadows seemed darker, and the silence was often broken by inexplicable sounds. On more than one occasion, I would hear footsteps echoing through empty hallways, or the faint sound of whispered conversations just out of earshot. It was unsettling, but nothing compared to what I would eventually encounter. My routine was always the same. I would turn on every light and unlock every door on the floor I was assigned to clean. This was partly to ensure my safety, but mostly to give myself peace of mind. Yet, despite these precautions, the creepy vibes persisted. My coworkers and I often shared stories of our experiences, and we all agreed that something was off about the place. One particular building stood out among the rest. It was known to have been used for exorcisms in the past, and just the thought of what had transpired there was enough to make my skin crawl. On one occasion, I was shampooing chairs in this very room when an entire stack of chairs in front of me began to rattle and shake violently. My heart pounded in my chest as I bolted out of the room, returning only with a coworker to put the chairs away. This happened to me 2 or 3 times, and I knew it wasn't the machine or improper stacking. Something unseen was at play. Another incident occurred while I was cleaning the lead pastor's office. With my headphones in, I was lost in the rhythm of my work when suddenly, all the hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stood up. An overwhelming sensation of pure hatred washed over me, a feeling so intense it was almost tangible. I felt as if something wanted me out of there immediately. Without a second thought, I dropped what I was doing and left the office. A few weeks later, I learned that the pastor had been struggling with severe spiritual warfare and had resigned from his position because he could no longer cope with it. Seeking answers, I spoke to a leader in the church about my experiences. His response was both unsettling and validating. He confirmed that such occurrences were not uncommon. A church isn't a holy ground where evil is automatically deflected, he explained. It's literally a battleground for spiritual warfare. His words resonated deeply with me, but they also added to the weight of fear I carried each time I entered the old buildings. One night, while I was locking up after a late event, I decided to take a detour through the basement of the oldest building. It was a part of the church I had always avoided, but something compelled me to face my fears. The basement was dimly lit, with long, narrow corridors and numerous storage rooms. As I walked through the maze-like passageways, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In one of the storage rooms, I noticed a faint, flickering light. My curiosity piqued. I cautiously approached. The room was empty except for an old, dusty mirror leaning against the far wall. The flickering light seemed to be coming from the mirror itself. As I stood before it, the reflection seemed normal at first, but then I saw it. A shadowy figure standing just behind me, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. but the fear remained, chilling me to the bone. That night, I couldn't sleep. My dreams were plagued with visions of the shadowy figure and the sensation of being trapped in that basement. I knew I had to do something, so the next day, I sought out the leader I had spoken to before. Together, we prayed and anointed the basement with holy water, hoping to cleanse it of whatever evil lingered there. The following weeks were quieter, but the sense of unease never truly left me. I continued my work, always vigilant, always aware of the unseen forces around me. My experiences at St. Mark's Church have forever changed my perception of the world. The line between the physical and the spiritual realms is thinner than we think, and the battles fought in the shadows are more real than we can imagine. To this day, I remain convinced that the church was a battleground for forces beyond our comprehension. My time there was a constant reminder of the spiritual warfare that rages unseen, a testament to the belief that evil does not shy away from holy places but rather seeks them out as grounds for its dark conflicts. In college, I was on my way out of the whole church thing, but I'd occasionally go to church with my family when I visited. They had just switched churches, and the pastor there was one of the kindest, most intelligent people I'd ever met in a church. He had long, straight hair and a gentle disposition. His sermons were well crafted, meticulously thought out, and he often brought up current social issues. His message was always one of understanding, compassion, and practicality, something you could actually enact in the real world. I admired him from the first time I heard him speak. One Sunday, after a particularly moving sermon, my mom convinced me to stay for the community lunch. As we mingled with the congregation, I found myself talking to the pastor. We exchanged pleasantries, and I could sense a genuine kindness in his eyes, a depth of understanding that went beyond the usual pastor facade. We talked for a while, and he even invited me to his office to continue our conversation. His office was a small, cozy room lined with bookshelves, each one crammed with theology texts, philosophy books, and literature. We sat and talked about various subjects, from faith to philosophy, and I felt a strange sense of comfort in his presence. He had an aura that made you feel safe and understood. Months later, while visiting my parents again, I found out that the pastor and his family had suddenly left the church. My parents were tight-lipped about the details, but there was a palpable tension in the air whenever his name was mentioned. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from the pastor. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. I need your help. Please come to the old church on Oak Street tonight at 9 p.m. A friend. Despite the cryptic nature of the letter, I felt compelled to go. I arrived at the old, abandoned church just before 9 p.m. The building was in a state of disrepair, with broken windows and an overgrown yard. As I approached, I noticed a faint light flickering inside. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The pews were covered in dust, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. I followed the light to the altar, where I found the pastor kneeling, his face buried in his hands. He looked up as I approached, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice trembling. I didn't know who else to turn to. He began to tell me his story. His wife had left him and taken their children after his daughter had accidentally revealed to a nursery worker that he sometimes wore his wife's clothes. The church had turned its back on him, and he had been shunned by the community he had dedicated his life to. As he spoke, I noticed something strange about the shadows in the room. They seemed to move on their own, writhing and twisting like living entities. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to focus on his words. "They called me a sinner, a pervert," he continued, his voice breaking. But I did nothing wrong. I just wanted to be myself, to find peace in who I am. Suddenly, the flickering light went out, plunging the room into darkness. I heard a low, guttural growl emanating from the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight. When I finally managed to turn it on, I saw the pastor standing before me, his eyes wide with terror. Behind him, the shadows had taken on a monstrous form, a dark, twisted figure with wide eyes and sharp, jagged teeth. "Run!" the pastor screamed, but it was too late. The shadowy figure lunged at him, and as it did, the facade shattered. The monster wasn't a monster at all. It was a man, dressed in dark, ragged clothes, his eyes filled with a burning hatred. He tackled the pastor to the ground, beating him mercilessly. I screamed and stumbled backward, dropping my phone. In the faint light, I could see the pastor's bloodied face, his eyes pleading for help. I turned and ran, bursting out of the church and into the night, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I called the police from my car, my hands shaking uncontrollably. They arrived quickly and entered the church, but when they emerged, they said there was no sign of the pastor or the attacker. Only a pool of blood on the altar remained as evidence of the violence that had occurred. The investigation went nowhere. The police found no leads, and the pastor was never seen again. Some whispered that he had been taken by the darkness, consumed by the secrets he kept. Others believed the attacker had come back and finished what he started, hiding the body where it would never be found. Years have passed, but I can still see the pastor's haunted eyes and hear his anguished screams. The memory of that night is a dark stain on my soul, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurk in the shadows of our minds, waiting to be unleashed.